One wrong chair. That's all it took to permanently erase the life Madeline Hayes had carefully built. She thought she was meeting an awkward accountant for a blind date at a dimly lit Manhattan restaurant. Instead, she sat across from Jordan Costello, the ruthless head of the city's most feared crime syndicate. By the time she realized her catastrophic mistake, a loaded gun was under the table. The doors were locked, and walking away was no longer an option. The relentless November rain lashed against the windows of the yellow cab as Madeline Hayes checked her reflection in her phone screen. At 28, Madeline was a pragmatist. She worked 60-hour weeks at a boutique architectural firm in Manhattan, paid her exorbitant rent on time, and avoided unnecessary risks. But tonight she was breaking her own rules. Her best friend Harper had practically begged her to go on this blind date. His name is Greg, Harper had insisted over the phone earlier that day. He's a risk analyst, super stable, wearing a charcoal grey suit. He reserved the secluded booth in the back of Lardois at 8. Just show up, Maddie. You need to live a little. Madeline shoved a crumpled $20 bill at the driver and bolted through the downpour, pushing through the heavy brass-handled oak doors of Lardois. The restaurant was a sanctuary of wealth and shadows. Dimly lit by flickering crystal sconces, the air smelled of truffles, expensive leather, and aged bourbon. It was the kind of establishment that didn't have prices on the menu. Brushing the damp hair from her face, Madeline glanced at her watch. 8:15 p.m. She was late. She bypassed the haughty hostess and navigated the maze of mahogany tables. Harper had said the secluded booth in the back. As she rounded the corner into the private alcove, she saw him. He was wearing a charcoal grey suit, but the man sitting in the leather booth looked nothing like a super-stable risk analyst. He was breathtakingly intimidating. His dark hair was styled with effortless precision, and his sharp, angular jawline was shadowed by a faint layer of stubble. He possessed the kind of brutal, unrefined magnetism that commanded the oxygen in the room. His eyes, a startling, icy blue, flicked upward from the crystal tumbler of amber liquid he was turning in his large, scarred hands. They locked onto her, analyzing her with the cold calculation of a predator, assessing a sudden intrusion. Madeline took a deep breath, forcing a socially acceptable smile, and slid into the booth across from him. "I am so sorry I'm late," she began, dropping her damp trench coat onto the leather seat beside her. The traffic on the FDR was an absolute nightmare, and my cab driver decided that traffic laws were merely suggestions. "You must be freezing waiting for me. Or bored. Please tell me you haven't been waiting long." The man did not blink. He slowly lowered his glass to the table, the ice clinking loudly in the sudden heavy silence. He leaned forward, the faint scent of bergamot and gun oil drifting across the table. "Who sent you?" His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down Madeline's spine. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. Madeline let out a breathless, awkward laugh, reaching for the water glass the waiter had previously left. "Harper, obviously. Though I have to admit, she completely underplayed you. She made you sound like well, no offense, but a spreadsheet enthusiast. A risk analyst." The man's eyes narrowed imperceptibly, the muscles in his jaw feathered. "A risk analyst." "Yes," Madeline continued, oblivious to the lethal tension radiating from the man across from her. "I'm Madeline, by the way, but you can call me Maddie. I know blind dates are notoriously awful, but I figured what's the worst that could happen? We share an overpriced plate of scallops and go our separate ways." Jordan Costello stared at the woman sitting across from him. For the first time in his 32 years of orchestrating the criminal underworld of the Eastern Seaboard, he was genuinely caught off guard. He was at Lardois waiting for a courier from the Russian syndicate, a man who was supposed to hand over a flash drive containing offshore accounts. Instead, A beautiful rain-soaked civilian with nervous, rambling energy had crashed into his private booth, claiming she was here for a blind date. He should have had his men who were stationed at the bar drag her out immediately. But as he looked at her, a strange, calculating thought crossed his mind. The Russians were notoriously paranoid. If they saw him sitting alone in a secluded booth, they might suspect an ambush. A woman, a beautiful, clueless woman, was the perfect cover. "Madeline," Jordan finally said, testing the syllables of her name on his tongue. It sounded like a promise. "No, I haven't been waiting long, and you're right. Blind dates can be full of surprises." "Exactly." Madeline smiled, feeling her anxiety marginally subside. Maybe Harper was right. Maybe she just needed to relax. "So, Greg, tell me about risk analysis. Is it as tedious as it sounds, or is there some secret, thrilling underworld to it?" Jordan's lips curved into a slow, chilling smirk. "You have no idea, Madeline. It's entirely about navigating the underworld, assessing threats, eliminating liabilities." "Wow," she chuckled, taking a sip of her water. "You take your job very seriously." "My life depends on it," he replied. Madeline thought he was simply leaning into a dry, sarcastic sense of humor. She was entirely unaware that the man sitting across from her had ordered the execution of 3 rival gang members before finishing his morning espresso. For the next 20 minutes, Madeline carried the conversation. She talked about her demanding boss, her love for mid-century modern architecture, and her disastrous track record with dating apps. Jordan simply listened, his icy blue eyes tracking her every micro-expression. He contributed very little, offering only single-syllable responses and cryptic dark remarks that Madeleine mistakenly interpreted as brooding charm. It was when the waiter finally approached their table that the illusion began to fracture. The waiter, an older man with silver hair, approached the booth with a silver tray. However, as he looked at Jordan, the color completely drained from his face. His hands gripping the tray began to tremble so violently that the silverware rattled against the metal. Mr. Costello!" The waiter stammered, his eyes darting frantically to the floor, actively avoiding Jordan's gaze. I apologize. We didn't know you were gracing us tonight. The chef wants to send out the Wagyu tomahawk on the house, naturally." Madeline frowned, looking from the terrified waiter to the man across from her. "Mr. Costello," she echoed, her brow furrowing in confusion. "I thought your last name was Higgins. Greg Higgins." Jordan didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the waiter with a dead, hollow stare. "That will be all, Francis. We don't want to be disturbed again. Understand?" "Yes, Capo." "Absolutely," the waiter whispered, bowing quickly before practically sprinting away from the table. Madeline's smile faltered. The air in the booth suddenly felt suffocatingly thin. "Capo," she whispered, her heart beginning to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at him, really looked at him this time. She noticed the subtle bulge beneath the left side of his impeccably tailored suit jacket. She noticed the way he was positioned, facing the door, tracking every single shadow that moved across the restaurant floor. "Who are you?" Madeline asked, her voice dropping to a trembling whisper. Her hands moved to her lap, her fingers curling into the fabric of her dress. Before Jordan could answer, the atmosphere in L'Ardoise underwent a violent shift. The heavy mahogany doors at the front of the restaurant swung open. 2 men stepped inside. They weren't wearing the standard Manhattan business attire. They wore long, heavy leather coats dripping with rain, and their faces were obscured by the shadows of wide-brimmed hats. They bypassed the hostess entirely, their hands concealed deep within their coat pockets, their eyes scanning the room with lethal intent. Jordan's posture instantly hardened into granite. Without breaking eye contact with the approaching men, his right hand slid smoothly beneath the white linen tablecloth. A second later, Madeline gasped as she felt the freezing heavy steel of a suppressed handgun brush against her bare knee under the table. "Don't move!" Jordan ordered, his voice a lethal vibrating command that left no room for negotiation. "Oh my God!" Madeline whimpered, the reality of her situation crashing down on her like a physical weight. Her lungs constricted. The restaurant, the date, the grey suit, it was all a catastrophic error. "You have a gun. You're not Greg." "No, I'm not," Jordan replied smoothly, his eyes locked on the two men who were now slowly navigating the aisles, moving steadily toward the back booth. "My name is Jordan Costello. And right now, Madeleine, you are going to smile, lean across this table, and act like you are desperately in love with me. Do it now." I can't." She choked out tears of absolute terror, pricking her eyes. "If those men realize who I am, they will open fire in the middle of this restaurant," Jordan stated, his tone devoid of any emotion. "And you are sitting directly in the crossfire. Lean in. Smile." Survival instinct, raw and unyielding, overrode Madeleine's panic. With trembling hands, she reached across the table, forcing a wide, synthetic smile onto her face. Jordan met her halfway. His large hand reached up his rough fingers, tangling into her damp hair at the nape of her neck. He pulled her close, so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. To the rest of the room, they looked like two lovers lost in an intimate whisper. To Madeline, it was a hostage situation. "Keep smiling," Jordan murmured against her cheek, his lips brushing her skin in a mockery of affection, while his hand beneath the table gripped the firearm. "They're 10 feet away. Don't look at them." Madeline closed her eyes, her breath hitching as the heavy footsteps of the two men approached their alcove. The scent of rain, damp leather, and cheap tobacco flooded her senses. The men paused right next to their booth. Madeline stopped breathing entirely. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the deafening roar of a gunshot. "Excuse me." A high-pitched nasal voice suddenly cut through the tension. Madeline's eyes snapped open. Standing behind the two menacing men in leather coats was a short, balding man in a drenched charcoal grey suit, clutching a bouquet of rapidly wilting daisies. "I'm looking for a Madeline," the balding man squeaked, looking at the two assassins, and then over their shoulders at Madeline and Jordan. "Are you—" "Maddie, I'm Greg Higgins. I think you're sitting at the wrong table." Time seemed to fracture. In the span of a single second, a dozen things happened at once. The two assassins, suddenly distracted by the bumbling arrival of the real Greg Higgins, turned their heads. It was the only opening Jordan Costello needed. Jordan's left hand shot out violently, shoving Madeline down into the leather seat. "Get down!" he roared. Before Greg could utter another word, Jordan brought his right hand up from beneath the table. The suppressed weapon let out 3 rapid, muted thwips. The sound was muffled like aggressive staple guns, but the impact was devastating. The first assassin crumpled instantly, a dark stain blossoming on his chest, crashing into the dessert cart with a shatter of glass. The second man managed to draw a heavy revolver from his coat, but Jordan was faster. He vaulted over the dining table with terrifying agility, his tailored suit completely at odds with the feral violence of his movements. He drove his knee into the second man's chest, twisting the assassin's wrist until a sickening crack echoed through the alcove, followed by another suppressed shot. Screams erupted from the front of the restaurant. Diners flipped tables, scrambling for the exits. The elegant illusion of l'ardoise dissolved into absolute pandemonium. Madeleine was curled into a ball on the floor beneath the table, Her hands clamped over her ears, her entire body shaking violently. She could hear the chaotic stampede of footsteps, the shattering of fine china, and the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor. "Greg!" Madeline sobbed, peeking out from under the linen tablecloth. Greg Higgins, the actual risk analyst, had fainted dead away at the sight of the blood, his wilting daisies scattered across the polished floorboards. Suddenly, a strong hand gripped Madeline's bicep, dragging her out from under the table with ruthless efficiency. Jordan stood over her, his chest heaving slightly, the gun still gripped firmly in his right hand. He looked down at the two dead men, bleeding onto the Persian rug, then back at Madeline. "We are leaving," Jordan commanded. "No!" Madeline screamed, ripping her arm out of his grasp, backing away until she hit the mahogany wall of the booth. "I'm not going anywhere with you. You're a murderer. You're a psycho. I'm calling the police." Jordan stepped closer, his imposing frame blocking the only exit from the alcove. The icy detachment in his eyes was replaced by a burning, furious urgency. "Listen to me very carefully, Madeline. Those men belong to the Falcone family. They were sent here to put a bullet in my head. You were sitting across from me playing my devoted girlfriend. The cameras in this restaurant have your face. The waitstaff saw you with me. By tomorrow morning, the Falcones will think you are my property. If I leave you here for the police, you won't survive the week." "I don't know you," she shrieked, hysterical tears streaming down her face. "I just sat at the wrong table. Let me go." "It doesn't matter what the truth is," Jordan said, stepping forward and grabbing both of her shoulders, hauling her flush against his chest. "In the Mafia, perception is reality. You are involved now. If you want to live to see tomorrow, you are coming with me." Before she could protest again, Jordan dragged her toward the kitchen, swinging doors. The kitchen staff had already abandoned their stations, leaving pots boiling over and flames dancing on the industrial stoves. Jordan navigated the stainless steel maze with the practiced ease of a man who spent his life preparing for ambushes. He kicked open the heavy metal exit door, dragging Madeline out into the freezing, rain-swept alleyway behind the restaurant. A massive armored black SUV was already idling in the alley, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt. The rear door flew open, and a towering man with a thick neck and a heavily scarred face stepped out, an assault rifle resting casually against his chest. "Boss!" The man grunted, his eyes flicking to the sobbing woman Jordan was dragging by the arm. "Vincent said there was a complication inside. Who's the girl?" "She's a civilian, Luca," Jordan growled, shoving Madeline into the cavernous back seat of the SUV before climbing in after her. "Get us out of here. Take us to the compound in Brooklyn. Now!" "Wait, please!" Madeline cried out, throwing her hands against the tinted window as the heavy door slammed shut, sealing her inside the soundproof vehicle. The locks engaged with a heavy final clunk. Jordan settled into the leather seat beside her, holstering his weapon beneath his jacket. He looked at her. Her mascara was running, her elegant dress was wrinkled, and she looked like a cornered rabbit. A strange, unfamiliar twinge of guilt flared in his chest, but he quickly smothered it beneath decades of hardened ruthlessness. "Cry all you want, Madeline," Jordan said quietly, the dark city rushing past the tinted windows as the SUV roared into the night. "But understand this, your old life ended the moment you sat down at my table. You belong to the Costello family now." The armored SUV snaked through the rain-slicked streets of Brooklyn, leaving the glittering, superficial skyline of Manhattan far behind. Inside the cavernous vehicle, the silence was absolute, heavy and suffocating. Madeline Hayes pressed her back against the cool leather of the seat, her knees pulled tight against her chest, as if attempting to minimize her physical existence. Her breathing was shallow, rapid and uneven. Every time the vehicle hit a pothole or took a sharp turn, She flinched her mind, replaying the deafening, suppressed thwips of Jordan Costello's weapon and the sickening thud of the assassins hitting the floor of the restaurant. Jordan sat beside her, perfectly still, a phantom in the dim, ambient light of the street lamps filtering through the heavily tinted windows. He was already detached, his mind, operating 10 steps ahead, calculating the fallout of the botched assassination attempt. The Falcone family had crossed a line tonight. Attempting a hit in a public restaurant in civilian territory was a desperate, unhinged move. Victor Falcone was growing impatient, and impatience in their world always led to bloodshed. The vehicle abruptly slowed, turning off the main avenue and onto a secluded, tree-lined road that seemed entirely out of place in the urban sprawl. Massive wrought-iron gates materialized from the heavy downpour, flanked by high stone walls, topped with security cameras and discreet coils of razor wire hidden beneath sprawling ivy. As the SUV approached, the gates swung inward with a heavy, mechanized groan. "Welcome to your new reality, Madeline," Jordan murmured, breaking the suffocating silence. His voice was entirely devoid of sympathy. It was a cold, clinical statement of fact. "You can't do this," Madeline whispered, her voice cracking completely raw from the adrenaline and the terror. "You cannot kidnap an innocent person. I have a job. I have a life. When I don't show up for work on Monday, my boss will call the police. My friend Harper will call the police. You are going to bring an entire federal investigation down on your head." Jordan turned to look at her. The icy blue of his eyes caught the glow of the dashboard lights. "The police?" he repeated, a dark, humorless chuckle vibrating in his chest. "The police commissioner plays golf with my uncle every Sunday in the Hamptons. The lead detective of the organized crime task force has a gambling debt that I hold the markers for. The police work for the city, Madeline, and the city belongs to me. Do not flatter yourself by thinking a missing persons report will breach these walls." The brutal finality of his words struck her like a physical blow. The last fragile tether she had to hope snapped. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her face into her knees, and allowed the quiet, desperate tears to fall. The SUV rolled to a halt on a circular cobblestone driveway in front of a sprawling limestone mansion. The architecture was imposing a blend of brutalist efficiency and old-world wealth. Heavy oak doors swung open before the vehicle even completely stopped, and 6 men poured out onto the porch. They were dressed similarly to Luca: dark clothing, sharp eyes, heavily armed, and radiating a predatory alertness. Luca opened the passenger door, the cold November rain instantly sweeping into the heated interior. Jordan stepped out first, unbothered by the downpour. He didn't look back to see if Madeline was following. He simply expected obedience. Luca leaned into the vehicle, his scarred face impassive. "Out, lady. Let's go." Trembling violently, Madeline slid out of the vehicle. The cold bit into her bones, but she barely felt it. She was entirely consumed by the surreal nightmare unfolding around her. She followed Jordan up the stone steps, surrounded by heavily armed guards, and stepped into the foyer of the Costello estate. If the exterior was brutalist, the interior was a masterpiece of intimidating luxury. High-vaulted ceilings, dark mahogany paneling, and floors of imported black marble reflected the glow of antique chandeliers. But despite the opulence, it felt like a fortress. There were no windows on the ground floor facing the street. The air was heavy, smelling of wood smoke, expensive cigars, and underlying tension. "Lorenzo!" Jordan barked, shrugging off his wet jacket and tossing it to a waiting guard. A tall, remarkably handsome man with olive skin and dark, calculating eyes emerged from an adjacent room. He moved with a languid grace that bellied the lethal sharpness in his gaze. Lorenzo was Jordan's underboss, a man who possessed a law degree from Harvard, but had chosen to apply his genius to the family business. "Brother," Lorenzo greeted his eyes instantly, locking onto Madeleine, who stood shivering and dripping wet on the marble floor. "I heard there was an incident at L'Ardoise. I see you brought home a souvenir." "Who is this a complication?" Jordan stated curtly, walking past Lorenzo and pouring himself a dark measure of whiskey from a crystal decanter. "The Falcones sent 2 triggers to the restaurant. They bypassed security. We have a leak, Enzo. Nobody knew I was making the drop tonight except the inner circle." Lorenzo's expression hardened, the easy charm vanishing instantly. "Are you sure?" "They walked right up to my booth," Jordan growled, downing the whiskey in one brutal swallow. "They knew exactly where I was sitting. This woman," he gestured vaguely toward Madeleine, "sat at the wrong table for a blind date. She provided cover long enough for me to draw first. But she's compromised. The cameras have her face. Victor Falcone will assume she's a courier or a new mistress. Either way, she's a target." Lorenzo stepped closer to Madeleine, studying her the way a scientist might study a new, unexpected specimen under a microscope. Madeleine shrank back, terrified by the cold, analytical gleam in his eyes. "She is a civilian," Lorenzo noted softly. "This is messy, Jordan. Bringing her here. It violates protocol. If she is a liability, we should handle her." Madeleine's heart stopped. Handle her. The euphemism was so casually delivered, so chillingly polite, that it took a second for the murderous intent to register. "No," she gasped, backing away, until her shoulders hit the heavy oak door. "No, please, I won't say anything. I swear to God. I'll change my name. I'll move to Europe. I'll disappear. You don't have to kill me." Jordan slammed his empty glass onto the mahogany sideboard with a violent crack that made everyone in the room flinch. "Nobody is touching her." Jordan's voice was a low, lethal purr that commanded absolute obedience. He stepped forward, placing himself deliberately between Lorenzo and Madeleine. "She is under my protection. Until the Falcone threat is neutralized and the mole is found, she remains here, confined to the guest wing." Lorenzo raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, though his eyes remained wary. "As you say, boss, but having a hysterical civilian wandering the compound while we prepare for a war is a tactical error." "Then make sure she doesn't wander," Jordan snapped. He turned his attention back to Madeleine. The vulnerability in her wide, tear-filled eyes struck a strange, entirely foreign chord within his chest. It was an annoyance, he told himself. Just an annoyance. "Genevieve will show you to your room. Do not attempt to leave the compound. The outer perimeter is rigged with motion sensors and guarded by men who will shoot first and ask questions later. Do you understand?" Madeleine couldn't speak. She simply nodded, a jerky, terrified motion. An older woman, stern-faced and dressed in immaculate black, appeared from the hallway. This was Genevieve the housekeeper, who ran the Costello estate with an iron fist. She took Madeleine gently by the elbow. "Come with me, miss. Let's get you out of those wet clothes." Madeleine allowed herself to be led away, her mind entirely numb. She was escorted up a sweeping grand staircase and down a long corridor lined with classic oil paintings and heavily locked doors. Genevieve finally opened a door at the end of the hall, ushering Madeleine into a sprawling, beautifully appointed bedroom. It had a king-sized bed, heavy velvet drapes, and an ensuite bathroom of white marble. It was a beautiful room, but as Genevieve stepped out and locked the heavy door from the outside, the metallic click echoed loudly in the quiet space. Madeleine slowly sank to the plush carpet, pulling her knees to her chest once more. She was a prisoner. She had survived a shootout, only to be locked in a gilded cage by the most dangerous man in New York City. For the next 3 days, Madeleine's entire world was confined to those 4 walls. Genevieve brought her meals on silver trays, gourmet food that tasted like ash in Madeline's mouth. She paced the room like a caged animal. She checked the windows, only to find them made of reinforced shatterproof glass that couldn't be opened more than an inch. She had no phone, no internet, no connection to the outside world. She thought about Harper, wondering if her friend was frantically calling hospitals and morgues. She thought about her job, her desk, with the half-finished architectural renderings of a new corporate plaza. Her old life felt like a dream she was rapidly forgetting. On the fourth evening, the terrifying monotony was broken. The heavy lock clicked, and the door swung open. Jordan Costello stood in the doorway. He looked exhausted. The sharp lines of his face were drawn tight with fatigue, and the shadows beneath his icy eyes were pronounced. He had traded his tailored suit for a dark Henley shirt and black tactical trousers, a holster strapped securely to his thigh. "Come with me," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Where?" Madeline demanded, her voice hoarse from days of silence and crying. A spark of defiance, fueled by sheer desperation, flickered in her chest. "Are you finally going to handle me?" Jordan sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. The gesture made him look startlingly human for a brief, fleeting moment. "If I wanted you dead, Madeline, you would have never left the restaurant. Come downstairs. You need to eat something other than a few bites of toast, and I am entirely out of patience for this hostage routine." "It is a hostage routine because you are holding me hostage," she snapped, stepping toward him, her anger momentarily overriding her terror. "You ruined my life. Because of your ridiculous Mafia war, I am locked in a bedroom like an animal." Jordan closed the distance between them with terrifying speed. Before she could react, he backed her up against the heavy mahogany dresser, his large hands gripping her waist. He didn't hurt her, but his proximity was overwhelming. He smelled of rain, dark coffee, and that same faint metallic scent of a weapon. "Listen to me," he whispered, his face inches from hers. The intensity in his eyes was blinding. "The Falcones tortured one of my captains to death yesterday. They are actively hunting for you. They have put a bounty of $500,000 on your head because they believe you are my weakness. I am keeping you locked in this room because it is the only place on this earth where I can guarantee nobody will put a bullet in your brain. Do you comprehend the reality of your situation yet?" Madeline stopped breathing, the defiance drained out of her, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. $500,000 for a woman who simply sat in the wrong chair. "Why do you care?" she whispered, staring up into his icy blue eyes. "I'm a liability. Lorenzo said it himself. Why don't you just give me to them or let me go?" Jordan stared at her for a long, heavy moment. His thumbs brushed unconsciously against the soft fabric of her borrowed sweater at her waist. He didn't have an answer. In his world, liabilities were eliminated. But every time he thought about someone hurting the terrified, brave woman standing in front of him, a violent, protective rage flared in his chest that he could not logically explain. "Because you were an innocent bystander," Jordan lied smoothly, his voice dropping an octave. "And I do not let the Falcones dictate who lives and dies in my city. Now come downstairs. We are having dinner." He released her and stepped back, the invisible tether between them snapping. Madeline took a shaky breath, realizing she had no choice. She followed the Mafia boss out of the room, stepping deeper into the labyrinth of his violent world. Dinner with the Costello inner circle was a masterclass in psychological warfare, masquerading as a civilized meal. The massive dining room was dominated by a long mahogany table. Jordan sat at the head, radiating an aura of absolute authority. To his right sat Lorenzo, swirling a glass of Barolo wine with an easy, deceptive smile. To his left was Matteo, a massive, heavily tattooed enforcer who barely spoke but radiated physical violence. Madeline sat near the end of the table, picking at a plate of seared sea bass, feeling like a lamb surrounded by a pack of highly coordinated wolves. The conversation flowed around her, spoken in rapid-fire Italian and heavily coded English. They were discussing shipments, territories, and retaliation. "The Port Authority is compromised," Lorenzo noted smoothly, cutting into his steak. "Victor has bribed the union boss. If we move the shipment through Red Hook, we walk right into an ambush." "Then we reroute to Staten Island," Matteo grunted. "Staten Island is too exposed," Jordan replied coldly, his eyes tracking a map spread across the opposite end of the table. "Victor is operating out of the old industrial complex on the waterfront. He's fortified it. Until we smoke him out, we are playing defense." Madeline, despite her terror, found herself looking at the architectural blueprints they had unrolled over the polished wood. Her mind, trained for years to analyze structural integrity, spatial flow, and structural vulnerabilities, automatically began to process the lines and symbols on the paper. She squinted, abandoning her food. The blueprint was of a massive pre-war industrial warehouse, the Falcone stronghold. She saw the load-bearing walls, the ventilation shafts, the reinforced steel doors they had noted with red markers. "You're looking at it wrong," Madeline blurted out. The entire table went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Lorenzo's smile vanished. Matteo's hand drifted instinctively toward the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. Jordan slowly raised his eyes from the map, locking on to her. The heavy, oppressive silence was deafening. "Excuse me," Lorenzo asked, his voice dripping with condescension and warning. Madeline's cheeks burned, but a sudden surge of professional confidence cut through her fear. She stood up, walking cautiously toward the end of the table where the blueprints were scattered. She was an architect. This was her language. "I said you're looking at the structure wrong," Madeline repeated, her voice trembling slightly before she forced it steady. She pointed a trembling finger at a section of the blueprint marked heavily in red ink by Jordan's men. "You have all your entry points marked here at the ground floor loading docks. You're assuming it's an impenetrable fortress because the walls are 3-foot thick reinforced concrete. It is an impenetrable fortress, sweetheart," Matteo scoffed, crossing his massive arms. "We lost 3 men trying to scout that perimeter last night." "It's not a fortress," Madeline shot back, looking directly at Jordan. "It's a death trap. This building was constructed in 1928 as a textile mill. I studied these exact blueprints in grad school for industrial urban retrofitting. See this?" She tapped a faint dotted line running vertically through the center of the structure. "This isn't a secondary support beam. It's an outdated gravity-fed ventilation shaft that connects directly to the sub-basement. It bypasses the ground floor entirely." Jordan stood up slowly, leaning over the table to look at where she was pointing. He was so close, she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "A ventilation shaft," he murmured. "Is it large enough to fit a man?" "It's an industrial intake," Madeline explained, her architectural brain taking over completely. "It's easily 3 feet wide. If you access the roof from the adjacent building, you can drop straight down into the sub-basement. The blueprints show the central power matrix is located right there. You don't have to breach the reinforced doors. You drop into the basement, cut the power, and their electronic security grids, their cameras, and their magnetic locks are instantly disabled." Lorenzo stared at the blueprint, his brilliant legal mind instantly calculating the tactical advantage. He looked at Madeline, genuine shock registering on his handsome face. "She's right," Lorenzo whispered. "By God, she's actually right. We've been looking at a frontal assault. She just handed us a back door." Jordan turned his head, looking down at Madeline. The icy detachment in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by a burning, intense admiration that made Madeline's breath hitch in her throat. He wasn't looking at a liability anymore. He was looking at a partner. "You studied this in grad school," Jordan stated softly. "I'm an architect," she whispered, suddenly, intensely aware of how close they were standing. "I know how buildings breathe. I know how they break." Jordan's lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile. It was the first genuine smile she had seen on his face, and it was entirely devastating. "Well, Madeleine Hayes, it seems sitting at the wrong table might have just won me a war." The dynamic in the compound shifted drastically after that night. Madeleine was no longer confined to her room. While she was still forbidden from leaving the estate, she was given free rein of the interior. Jordan ordered a drafting table brought into his private study. She spent hours poring over city records, architectural plans, and municipal blueprints, helping Jordan's men identify structural weaknesses in Falcone properties. It was an insane, surreal existence. By day, she was the structural mastermind for a Mafia syndicate. By night, she found herself spending hours sitting with Jordan in front of the massive fireplace in his study. The terror had gradually morphed into something infinitely more dangerous, an undeniable electric connection. She learned that Jordan had never wanted the life. He was thrust into the role of capo when his father was assassinated, forced to become a monster to protect his family from being slaughtered by rivals. She saw the immense, crushing weight of leadership that he carried, the exhaustion he hid from his men. And Jordan found himself completely captivated by the brilliant, pragmatic woman who refused to back down from him. She didn't cower. She argued with him over tactical approaches. She challenged his cynical worldview. She was entirely alien to his world of blood and betrayal, yet she fit into his life with a perfect, terrifying precision. But the looming threat of the mole remained. The Falcones were still anticipating their movements, ambushing their supply lines with eerie accuracy. Only someone in the inner circle could be feeding Victor Falcone the information. One evening, a week after the dinner revelation, Madeleine was alone in Jordan's study. The men were out executing a raid based on her architectural intelligence. She was at the drafting table organizing a stack of property deeds when a loose piece of paper slipped from the bottom of Lorenzo's leather portfolio, which he had left on the desk. Madeleine bent down to pick it up. It was a bank transfer slip, a wire transfer for an exorbitant amount of money to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. She frowned, reading the details. The account holder's name was heavily encrypted, but the routing number was accompanied by a strange, handwritten note in the margin. It was a sequence of numbers. Coordinates. Madeleine's blood ran completely cold. She recognized those coordinates. They were the exact GPS coordinates of the Brooklyn compound. The door to the study slowly clicked shut. Madeleine spun around her heart, hammering wildly against her ribs. Lorenzo stood in the doorway. The easy, charming smile was gone. His eyes were dead, devoid of any humanity. He slowly reached beneath his tailored suit jacket and drew a suppressed handgun, pointing it directly at her chest. "You are far too clever for your own good, Madeleine," Lorenzo said softly, the silence of the room amplifying the deadly click of the weapon's safety, being disengaged. "I told Jordan you were a liability. I just didn't realize you would be a liability to me." The reality crashed down on her with devastating clarity. Lorenzo, the underboss, the man Jordan trusted implicitly. He was the mole. He was selling out his own family to Victor Falcone to seize power for himself. "Lorenzo," Madeleine whispered, backing away slowly, her hand desperately searching the drafting table behind her for anything she could use as a weapon. She gripped the heavy metal edge of a T-square ruler. "You're betraying him. He's your brother." In this life, blood is just a currency, sweetheart, Lorenzo sneered, raising the gun. Victor Falcone offered me the entire Brooklyn territory once Jordan is dead. I tipped them off about the restaurant, and tonight I tipped them off about the raid. Jordan isn't coming back. He's walking into a bloodbath, and you are the tragic casualty of a Falcone counterattack. He leveled the weapon squarely at her heart. Madeline squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the metal ruler, bracing for the impact that would end her life. Suddenly, a violent explosion shattered the heavy oak doors of the study, sending splinters of wood flying across the room. Before Lorenzo could pull the trigger, a towering shadow filled the doorway. Jordan Costello stood amidst the smoke, and ruined wood bleeding from a cut above his eye, his suit torn, and his eyes blazing with a feral, murderous fury. He didn't hesitate. He didn't speak. He raised his weapon and fired. The deafening roar of the gunshot in the enclosed mahogany study was apocalyptic. The sound wave physically struck Madeline Hayes in the chest, stealing the breath from her lungs, as the heavy, suppressed thwip of Lorenzo's weapon was entirely eclipsed by the unsuppressed, thunderous explosion of Jordan Costello's heavy-caliber firearm. Lorenzo did not even have the fraction of a second required to register the shock on his perfectly handsome face. The bullet caught him high in the right shoulder, the sheer kinetic force of the impact spinning his tall frame violently backward. His suppressed handgun clattered uselessly across the polished hardwood floor, sliding until it hit the baseboard of the towering bookshelves. Lorenzo collapsed against the leather sofa, clutching his shattered collarbone, a harsh, ragged gasp tearing from his throat as dark crimson immediately saturated his pristine, tailored Italian suit. Madeline dropped the metal T-square ruler, her knees completely giving out. She slid down the side of the drafting table, her hands covering her face, as a delayed hysterical sob ripped through her chest. Jordan did not lower his weapon. He stepped through the ruined, splintered remains of the heavy oak doors, his imposing frame casting a long, terrifying shadow across the Persian rug. He looked like a demon summoned straight from the lowest circles of hell. His normally immaculate dark hair was matted with dust and rain, a jagged laceration above his left eyebrow, weeping blood down the side of his face. His expensive jacket was torn, coated in the gritty ash of an explosion, but his icy blue eyes burned with a lethal, unadulterated fury that anchored the entire room to his presence. Behind him, the massive, heavily tattooed frame of Matteo stepped into the study. Matteo's face was smeared with soot, his assault rifle raised and sweeping the corners of the room before settling squarely on the bleeding underboss, writhing on the sofa. "Matteo." Jordan's voice was a low, vibrating growl that barely sounded human. "Secure the perimeter. Bind his hands. If he twitches in a way you do not like, put a bullet in his kneecap." "With pleasure, capo," Matteo grunted, moving forward with terrifying, predatory grace. Jordan finally holstered his weapon and crossed the room in 3 long strides, dropping to his knees beside Madeline. The violent, murderous aura radiating from him vanished the second his hands touched her shoulders. He pulled her trembling hands away from her face, his thumbs gently wiping away the hot, terrified tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Madeline," he whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, desperate emotion she had never heard from him before. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you? Tell me right now if he touched you." "I'm fine." She choked out her fingers, instinctively gripping the lapels of his ruined jacket, anchoring herself to his solid warmth. "Jordan, he had the coordinates. He tipped off Victor Falcone. He said you were walking into a bloodbath. I thought you were dead." Jordan's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering furiously beneath his bruised skin. He pulled her flush against his chest, wrapping his arms around her and burying his face in her hair. He held her with a desperate, bruising force, as if trying to shield her from the violent reality of the world he had dragged her into. "He tried," Jordan murmured against her temple, the scent of cordite rain and blood clinging to him. "Lorenzo fed us a false location for the Falcone weapons cache near the Gowanus Canal. It was rigged with industrial explosives, but Matteo noticed the sentries were positioned incorrectly. They were braced for an explosion, not an assault. We pulled back just as the warehouse detonated. The blast caught the edge of our convoy, but we survived. It was the confirmation I needed. Only my inner circle knew the coordinates of that raid." Jordan pulled back slightly, his icy eyes locking onto Lorenzo, who was now bound with heavy zip ties, his face pale with shock and blood loss, as Matteo stood over him. "You broke my heart, Enzo." Jordan said, the quiet sorrow in his voice infinitely more terrifying than his anger. "We grew up together. I trusted you with my life. I trusted you with her life." Lorenzo let out a wet, agonizing cough, a bloody smile twisting his handsome features. "You are weak, Jordan. You brought a civilian into the compound. You let her sit at the war table. You started thinking with your heart instead of your head. Victor Falcone promised me the empire. You were going to get us all killed over a woman who sat at the wrong table in a restaurant." "You are a fool," Jordan replied coldly, rising to his feet and pulling Madeline up with him, tucking her safely behind his broad back. "This woman just handed me the blueprints to destroy Victor Falcone. She is twice the tactician you will ever be. Take him to the basement, Matteo. We will deal with his treachery when the sun comes up." As Matteo hauled the disgraced underboss out of the ruined study, leaving a trail of blood on the marble floor of the hallway, the adrenaline finally began to recede from Madeleine's veins, leaving her shaking and exhausted. She looked at the blood drying on Jordan's forehead, reaching up with a trembling hand to trace the edge of the laceration. "You need a doctor," she whispered softly. Jordan caught her hand, pressing his lips to her palm. His eyes softened the icy blue, melting into something infinitely warmer, something dangerously close to devotion. "I need you to listen to me, Madeline. Lorenzo's betrayal changes the timeline. The Falcones know we survived the ambush at the Gowanus Canal. Victor will realize Lorenzo failed. By midnight, Victor will barricade himself inside the Red Hook warehouse. He will surround himself with every mercenary he has on the payroll. The ventilation shaft." Madeline said instantly, her mind snapping back to the architectural blueprints she had meticulously studied. "You have to go tonight, before they can reinforce the sub-basement. If you wait until tomorrow, they will seal the roof access." "We are going tonight," Jordan confirmed, his hands resting heavily on her waist. "But I need you to understand what happens next. If I do not come back from Red Hook, Luca has orders to escort you to a private airfield in New Jersey. There is an offshore account in your name with enough money to disappear completely. You will be free." Madeleine's heart contracted violently. The gilded cage she had been locked inside for the past 2 weeks had fundamentally altered her. The terrified architect who had cowered under the table at L'Ardoise was gone. She looked at the ruthless Mafia boss standing before her, a man capable of unspeakable violence, yet who had systematically dismantled his own empire to keep her safe. "You are coming back," Madeleine demanded, her voice losing its tremor, replaced by a fierce, undeniable resolve. "You are going to take the roof access from the adjacent building. You are going to drop into the power matrix. You are going to cut their security grids, and you are going to end this war. Do you understand me, Jordan Costello?" A slow, devastatingly handsome smile spread across Jordan's bruised face. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a bruising, desperate kiss that tasted of iron adrenaline and undeniable possession. It was a promise forged in the fires of a criminal underworld, a vow spoken in the language of survival. "I always follow the architect's plans," he whispered against her lips. The rain had intensified into a torrential downpour by the time the Costello strike team arrived at the desolate industrial waterfront of Red Hook. The massive pre-war textile mill loomed in the darkness like a monolithic concrete tomb entirely devoid of light. Victor Falcone had fortified the ground floor precisely as Jordan had anticipated. Heavy steel barricades blocked the loading docks, and heavily armed sentries patrolled the perimeter with night vision optics, their silhouettes barely visible against the churning black waters of the East River. 2 miles away, sitting in the secure communications room of the Brooklyn compound, Madeleine Hayes stared unblinkingly at a bank of glowing monitors. Beside her, Luca manned the encrypted radio frequencies. Madeleine had a copy of the architectural blueprints spread across the console, her finger tracing the dotted line of the outdated ventilation shaft. "Alpha Team is in position on the adjacent roof." Jordan's voice crackled through the secure comms, barely audible over the sound of the driving rain and the howling waterfront wind. "We have eyes on the industrial intake." "Be careful, Jordan," Madeleine said, pressing the microphone button, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "The structural integrity of that shaft is nearly a century old. The mortar will be degrading. Keep your points of contact wide as you rappel down." "Copy that, sweetheart," Jordan replied, a faint note of amusement echoing in the earpiece. "Going dark." For the next 20 agonizing minutes, the comms were completely silent. Madeleine felt as though she were holding her breath for the entire duration. She watched the digital clock on the monitor tick relentlessly forward. In her mind, she visualized Jordan and Matteo navigating the narrow claustrophobic darkness of the vertical shaft suspended entirely by tactical harnesses, descending 50 feet straight down into the belly of the enemy stronghold. If her architectural analysis was wrong, if the Falcones had renovated the sub-basement and sealed the intake, Jordan was rappelling directly into a concrete coffin. Suddenly, the encrypted radio burst to life with a blast of static. "Touchdown!" Matteo's rough voice echoed through the speakers. "We are in the sub-basement. No hostiles." She was right, boss. "The main power matrix is directly ahead." Madeleine let out a shuddering breath, burying her face in her hands for a brief second before snapping her attention back to the blueprints. "Cut the main breaker and the auxiliary backup," she instructed rapidly. "The magnetic locks on the heavy steel doors will fail open, and their entire camera grid will go blind." "Executing now," Jordan replied. Seconds later, the external surveillance drones operated by Luca captured the massive industrial warehouse, plunging into absolute chaotic darkness. The security floodlights mounted on the concrete walls died instantly. "Power is down," Luca announced, a vicious grin splitting his scarred face. "The fortress is completely blind." What followed was a masterclass in tactical dominance. Without their electronic security, the Falcone syndicate was entirely paralyzed. Jordan's secondary strike teams waiting in the shadows of the loading docks breached the failed magnetic doors with terrifying speed. The ensuing firefight was brief, brutal, and decisively one-sided. The Costello enforcers swept through the warehouse with military precision, eliminating the mercenaries who stumbled blindly through the darkened corridors. Victor Falcone, the ruthless kingpin who had ordered the hit at the restaurant, was found cowering in the top-floor executive office, entirely abandoned by his men. He did not get the opportunity to surrender. Jordan ended the war with a single, suppressed shot in the darkness, the culmination of decades of blood and rivalry, finally silenced on the cold concrete floor. By the time the sun began to rise over the Manhattan skyline, painting the heavy rain clouds in bruised shades of purple and gold, the Costello armored SUV rolled back through the wrought iron gates of the Brooklyn compound. Madeline was waiting on the front steps, wrapped in a heavy woolen shawl against the biting morning chill. She watched as Jordan stepped out of the vehicle. He looked exhausted, covered in the grim reality of his violent profession, but his posture was straight, the crushing weight of the Falcone threat permanently lifted from his shoulders. He walked up the stone steps, stopping 2 feet away from her. The silence between them was heavy pregnant with the realization that the absolute necessity of her confinement had fundamentally ended. Jordan reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key. He held it out to her, his icy blue eyes completely unreadable. "The war is over," Jordan said quietly, his voice raspy from the smoke and shouting. "Victor Falcone is dead. Lorenzo is being dealt with. There are no more bounties, no more assassins. The mole has been eradicated. The gate is unlocked, Madeline. You have your phone back. The offshore account is fully funded. You can walk out of these gates right now, take a cab back to Manhattan, and pretend you never sat at my table." Madeline looked at the brass key resting in his scarred palm. She looked past him at the towering wrought-iron gates that stood wide open for the first time in weeks, revealing the quiet, tree-lined Brooklyn street beyond. Freedom was exactly 50 yards away. She could return to her boutique architectural firm. She could return to her exorbitant rent, her 60-hour work weeks, and the mundane safety of her pragmatic life. She slowly raised her eyes to meet his. She saw the terrifying, brutal Mafia capo who commanded the criminal underworld. But she also saw the man who had risked everything to shield a stranger. The man who listened to her, who respected her brilliance, and who looked at her as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to his own humanity. Madeleine reached out her delicate fingers, brushing against his rough palm. But instead of taking the key, she closed his fingers over it, pushing his hand gently away. "I don't think I can go back to drawing corporate plazas, Jordan." Madeleine whispered, a bold, dangerous smile curving her lips as she stepped into his space, sliding her arms around his waist. "Besides, this compound has terrible cross-ventilation. It requires a complete architectural overhaul, and I am the only one qualified for the job." Jordan let out a low, ragged breath, the final, invisible barrier between them shattering completely. He dropped the key onto the marble porch, wrapping his arms fiercely around her, burying his face in her neck as he pulled her flush against him. He had won the war, but in the end, it was the woman who sat at the wrong table who had entirely conquered him. Did Madeline make the right choice by staying in the perilous, shadowy underworld of the Costello Syndicate, or should she have walked away when the doors finally opened? Her catastrophic blind date proved that sometimes sitting at the wrong table leads you exactly where you are meant to be. If you were captivated by this thrilling Mafia romance, please remember to hit that like button, share this gripping story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more dark, twist-filled, romantic dramas. Always ring the notification bell so you never miss out on another dangerous love story. Thank you.